A bigoted woman heaps insults upon a black serviceman during a plane trip, only to discover the extent of her mistake the following day when she tunes in to a news broadcast. The waiting zone at Chicago O'Hare International Airport was already thrumming with restless passengers on a dreary, gusty November morning. Wandering announcements sliced through the low drone of conversation, reminding everyone to confirm their departure gates, keep track of their belongings, and stay aware of last-minute scheduling updates. Under the harsh fluorescent glow, a mixture of people, parents with strollers, professionals in business attire, and students lugging backpacks, clustered around gate H-17. The flight to Atlanta, originally slated for 9 a.m., had been pushed back, aggravating many travelers. Standing at the center of a small knot of first-class passengers was Julia Prescott, a corporate executive in her early 30s. She donned a tailored gray blazer and matching pencil skirt, her blonde hair pinned neatly with a subtle silver barrette. Impatient tapping from her black pump signaled she was someone who typically got instant results. She was heading to a prestigious management symposium, intending to dazzle her way to an influential promotion. As she checked her phone, she skimmed through one urgent email after another from co-workers who needed flawless budgets and PowerPoint decks. Julia tried and failed to tamp down her mounting exasperation. At last, a crackling overhead announcement signaled pre-boarding for first class. Julia let out a sharp sigh, relieved to escape the restless crowd. Gripping her designer handbag and a glossy tote filled with her laptop and files, she strode down the jet bridge with quick, clipped steps. Once inside the aircraft, the first-class cabin revealed its usual perks: extra wide seats and the promise of bubbly drinks before takeoff. Julia claimed seat 2A and efficiently loaded her belongings into the overhead bin. She made a show of checking her phone yet again, scrolling through frantic messages labeled urgent. A few moments later, a tall, broad-shouldered black man dressed in a crisp army uniform stepped to the front of the cabin, surveying the row numbers. His name tag read D. Parker. He gave Julia a courteous nod, indicating the seat next to her, 2B. Julia's green eyes flickered with annoyance, but she managed a stiff, polite grin, all the while mulling over whether his seat had come from some special offer or a military courtesy. A snide little voice in her head insisted he couldn't possibly have paid the exorbitant fare. Feeling disgruntled, she sank into her plush seat and fastened the seatbelt, making it obvious that polite conversation was the last thing on her mind. Once Daniel Parker settled into seat 2B, he again nodded politely in Julia's direction, though she conspicuously turned away, gazing through the window as though it were far more compelling than a fellow passenger. Flight attendants swept through the aisle offering pre-departure beverages, sparkling water, juice, perhaps champagne, and one attendant, upon spotting Daniel's uniform, thanked him warmly for his service and said to let them know if he needed anything. Julia felt her stomach tighten with resentment. Of course, she thought sourly, they're bending over backwards to show gratitude. She pressed her lips into a thin line and tapped at her phone, feigning deep concentration. She'd long believed she was colorblind, but at moments like this, whenever her sense of entitlement felt even slightly threatened, her underlying biases flared. Before long, all of the first-class passengers were settled, and the cabin door was secured. As the plane taxied away from the gate, Daniel discreetly withdrew a photograph from his uniform's inner pocket, glancing at it with a subdued smile. Julia noticed a picture in her peripheral vision. A child of about 8 or 9, beaming with a sparkly headband and clutching a soccer ball. Unable to stifle her curiosity, Julia turned and spoke with an icily polite tone. "Cute kid. Your daughter." Daniel turned toward her, mild surprise flickering across his features. "Yes, ma'am. That's my daughter, Kayla." Julia almost rolled her eyes at ma'am. Feeling uncomfortably older than her status-driven lifestyle led her to believe she was. "I see. I suppose she's proud her dad's in uniform," she said, a faint edge of sarcasm trailing her words. "Are you on your way back from deployment or something?" "I'm actually traveling to Atlanta to see her," Daniel replied, his manner calm but somewhat guarded. Julia, already frazzled by the delayed flight, bristled at how little he elaborated. She sensed an inexplicable compulsion to push, as though clarifying her personal space. "It must be great to get bumped up to first class," she pressed, her meaning transparent. "You are sitting here, right?" Daniel's jaw tensed. "I purchased this seat," he said quietly. "I'm not trying to get freebies, if that's what you're suggesting." His polite but firm tone openly challenged the unspoken stereotypes swirling in Julia's mind. She inhaled, working hard to stay composed, yet felt irritated about being contradicted. She slipped one earbud into her right ear, letting the music wall her off from conversation. Inside, however, she still simmered with a certain disapproval. As the flight progressed, the cabin lights dimmed and the attendants began serving lunch, salmon or pasta, with a small salad and warm bread. Julia chose pasta and requested a glass of Chardonnay, hoping it might quell the resentment she could feel coursing through her. She cast the occasional sideways glance at Daniel, noticing he politely declined any alcohol. The attendant, once again, thanked him for his service and indicated he could have whatever he liked with the airline's compliments. Julia's veneer of restraint slipped. "Don't you ever get fed up with all these people fussing over you just because you're wearing a uniform?" she demanded, quiet venom in her tone. Daniel's brow creased. "I appreciate people's kindness, but I don't go around begging for it," he answered. "Really?" Julia shot back. "Because it sure seems like you're everyone's hero, while the rest of us, who also work hard, don't get free perks." Daniel set his fork down. "Ma'am, if that's bothering you, I can pay for my own meal," he said softly. "This isn't an issue for me." She shrugged, her composure cracking just enough to reveal a creeping prejudice. "It's the principle," she said. Beneath her words lay layers of bias. She never truly confronted how uneasy she felt about black men who received public accolades. It struck at her own unspoken sense of superiority. Daniel turned his face away, a flicker of hurt in his expression, but he said nothing more. After a pause, he quietly offered, "I'm headed to Atlanta because my daughter is having serious medical complications. I need to be there for her." Julia froze. For an instant, she felt a pang of sympathy, yet almost instantly, she pushed it aside. "Good luck," she muttered, returning her attention to her pasta, dismissing him in her mind as another person who would claim hardship if it benefited them. Nonetheless, a thin thread of unease wound through her, as she couldn't forget the sight of Kayla's bright smile in that picture. When the plane finally touched down at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, a collective sense of relief rippled through the cabin. The flight attendants rattled off details about baggage claim and the rainy forecast. Julia unbuckled and prepared to dash off, pointedly avoiding eye contact with Daniel. As she stepped off the plane, though, she overheard him speaking into his phone. "Yes, Miss Carter, I'm on the ground now. I'll head to the hospital soon." There was genuine anxiety in his tone. Julia felt the faintest twinge of discomfort, but she tamped it down. She had her own obligations. Inside the terminal, she hurried toward baggage claim, ignoring the swirl of people. The emotional reunions, the rushing professionals, the tourists gawking at huge signage. Her phone vibrated with a text. "We need your updated slides, ASP. The big pitch is tomorrow morning. Where are you?" Julia typed out a terse response, glancing around once more to make sure the soldier she clashed with wasn't trailing behind her. At the carousel, she snatched up her sleek silver suitcase. Turning around, she spotted Daniel across the room, still on his phone, brow furrowed. A small, involuntary wave of empathy rippled through her, but she shook it off. "I've got a conference to own," she reminded herself. Soon she settled into the back seat of her pre-booked car, listening to the rain pound against the roof. "Harborwood Hotel, please," she instructed the driver, who then navigated into the maze of Atlanta traffic. Julia rested her head against the seat, scrolling through her phone to review data for tomorrow's event. But she kept recalling Daniel's worried voice. She muttered to herself. Soldiers come home with sob stories all the time. Everyone faces difficulties. The following morning, Julia's conference kicked off in a tall downtown building. The venue was abuzz with business chatter about new market possibilities, best practices in leadership, and discreet rumors of major corporate acquisitions. Julia introduced herself around with confidence, distributed her business cards, and booted up her laptop for her keynote session. She reveled in the thrill of the corporate stage, each handshake fueling her self-assuredness. After she concluded her talk, complete with refined slides, pertinent data, and just the right amount of wit, she received a flurry of nods and polite compliments. Soon after, her phone pinged with an alert from a local Atlanta news app. Local Army sergeant's daughter fighting for her life. Community responds. A tiny hospital room photograph caught her eye. Normally, she would have dismissed the headline. Instead, she found herself clicking. The story introduced Sergeant Daniel Parker, newly returned from overseas, who was pleading for help on behalf of his daughter, Kayla, battling a life-threatening congenital heart condition. One glance at the photo revealed the same small girl from the plane, now hooked up to tubes in a pediatric ICU. Words like experimental procedure, insurance gap, and urgent fundraiser jumped out. Apparently, Daniel had come stateside on emergency leave after Kayla's condition worsened. She needed highly specialized surgery at an Atlanta children's hospital, but military insurance wouldn't fully cover it. Julia's heart thumped. She remembered her mocking words, her insinuations that Daniel was looking for something he hadn't earned. Shame mingled with the mental image of Kayla's radiant grin. He wasn't faking anything. Locking her phone, Julia felt unsettled. She almost pushed it all aside as just another sorrowful headline. But she couldn't forget Kayla's photograph. A crack had formed in her usual armor. That evening, after the day's conference sessions wrapped, Julia joined the cocktail mingling. Attendees sipped champagne, swapped success stories, and traded business cards. She wore a sleek black cocktail dress and maintained her polished corporate persona, but underneath, she was distracted. Each conversation about profit margins, recruitment strategies, or bonus structures brought Kayla's face to mind, tethered to tubes and monitors. The feeling gnawed at her conscience. Eventually, Julia excused herself, finding a quieter corner by a large picture window that showcased Atlanta's glittering skyline. Normally, she would bask in the city lights, but now they seemed dulled. She reopened the news article, clicked the fundraiser link for Kayla Parker's surgery. The web page displayed a goal of $150,000, with only $37,000 raised so far. Donations range from $10 to a couple $100, accompanied by short messages of support or prayers. Julia swallowed thickly, aware that her own salary and investments offered her an extremely comfortable life. She'd never really considered giving away a huge sum to someone she barely knew. Her inner monologue had always been about fairness. Hadn't she earned her achievements through grit and hours of hard work? But reading the plea in Daniel's words shattered that insular viewpoint. Kayla needed specialized surgery that wasn't covered. They were facing staggering bills. Julia began typing a donation amount, paused, erased it, and typed again. Could she truly give away thousands of dollars on a whim? A memory flashed. Her cruel remarks toward Daniel, the unsubtle racism she'd flung at him. She pressed her lips together. Slowly, she typed $10,000. Her heart pounded as she clicked donate. A confirmation popped up with her full name, Julia Prescott, no anonymity. She realized that Daniel would recognize the name if he saw it. A blend of regret, relief, and anxiety filled her. Setting the phone aside, she massaged her temples. A mere chunk of money wouldn't redeem her behavior. I owe them a genuine apology, she murmured, but this is at least a start. Restless sleep claimed her that night. Before sunrise, she penned a note for her team explaining she had a personal emergency and would check in later. Borrowing the address from the fundraiser, she rented a compact sedan and drove to Peachtree Children's Hospital. The facility sprawled, decorated with murals of cartoon creatures. Anxiety twisted her stomach as she found her way to the pediatric cardiac ICU on the third floor. The sterile smell of antiseptics filled the corridors, while machines beeped in the background and nurses in pastel scrubs moved about purposefully. At the main desk, Julia hesitantly asked about Kayla Parker. A nurse scrolled through a digital tablet. "Are you family?" Julia felt her cheeks grow warm. "I'm a friend," she managed, knowing how hollow that sounded. The nurse frowned but rang Kayla's father to confirm, then pointed Julia toward a hallway lined with childlike paintings. Julia stopped in front of room 312, spotting Daniel through the large window. He stood by a metal hospital bed, gently stroking Kayla's hand. Kayla, dwarfed by the 4 tubes and monitors, lay very still, the faint hiss of an oxygen line by her nose. Summoning courage, Julia rapped lightly on the doorframe. Daniel turned, eyebrows lifting in surprise. "Miss Prescott," he said, his voice an odd mix of caution and confusion. Julia's pulse thundered. Stepping inside, she noticed stuffed animals everywhere, a lively plastic heart poster on one wall, and the unrelenting beep of the heart monitor. "I read about Kayla in the news," Julia began, her words shaky. "I know this is probably awkward, but I wanted to see you both." Daniel's gaze was heavy with sadness rather than anger. He brushed a damp curl from Kayla's forehead. "She's in critical condition," he said quietly. "They think a specialized surgery is our best hope." Julia laced her fingers together, a lump forming in her throat. "I'm truly sorry," she whispered, tears stinging at the corners of her eyes. Kayla stirred, blinking sleepily, her cheeks pale. Daniel bent low to whisper, "Sweetie, you have a visitor." Kayla blinked again, turning her head just enough to focus on Julia. "Hi, Kayla," Julia said softly, inching closer. "I met your dad on the plane. I heard you're really brave." Kayla tried to smile, but seemed exhausted. "Daddy says I'm strong," she said in a frail voice, eyes drifting to the monitors. Julia felt her heart twist at the fragility on display. Kayla soon drifted back to a half-sleep, her tiny fingers loosely holding Daniel's hand. Quietly, Daniel turned to Julia. "Why did you come here?" he asked, his tone not hostile, but laced with genuine confusion. Julia swallowed. "I saw the fundraiser. I remember what I said on the plane. It was ignorant, rude, and cruel. I felt compelled to help somehow. I donated some money. I know it doesn't fix anything, but..." She trailed off, unable to finish. Daniel studied her face for several moments. "You were pretty harsh," he admitted, "but I appreciate your donation, even if Kayla's situation can't just be solved with a check. I'm fighting for her life." Julia's eyes welled up with tears as she nodded. "I realize that, but I want to do more. I'm sorry." In the ensuing days, Julia found herself increasingly wrapped up in Kayla's situation. She tried to juggle her conference obligations, but any free moment she had, she spent at the hospital. She brought bright-colored crayons and activity books to amuse Kayla, along with stuffed animals bearing cheesy motivational slogans. Her initial contribution had prompted more donations from some of her corporate friends. Yet Julia sensed that Daniel also needed assistance navigating insurance forms and exploring second opinions. She offered her organizational prowess, something she typically reserved for major business deals. He was hesitant, not wanting pity or another sense of obligation, but the sheer complexity of Kayla's case finally led him to accept. Julia tackled the project the way she'd handle a high-stakes corporate pitch, meticulously making calls, searching for specialists, and figuring out which surgeons had the best track record for Kayla's specific heart condition. They found one particularly renowned surgeon, but the backlog was immense. One sunny afternoon, Julia stepped out of the hospital, phone to her ear, trying to leverage an acquaintance who managed special medical clearances. Normally, she'd use such connections solely for personal gain. Now, she was using them for a child she barely knew, albeit a child she had grown to care for. When texts came in from her colleagues complaining about her absence, she simply answered, "I have an emergency. I'll let you know when I'm free." Eventually, between the heightened publicity around Kayla's story, mounting donations, and the philanthropic initiatives of the hospital, the specialized surgeon agreed to take Kayla's case sooner. Julia attended a hospital board meeting to present Kayla's urgent needs, employing the same persuasive skills that typically wowed corporate boards. For once, she wasn't promoting herself. She was advocating for a child's life. The day of Kayla's operation arrived amid a whirl of anxiety, quick goodbyes, and trembling hope. As nurses prepared Kayla for surgery, she clutched a small teddy bear Julia had given her, offering a trembling smile while tears glossed her eyes. Julia and Daniel waited in a family lounge, joined by a few of Daniel's relatives who had hurried there. The hours crawled, measured by the relentlessly ticking clock and the shallow breathing of all who waited. Finally, the surgeon emerged, looking tired yet relieved. "The surgery went as planned," he reported. "We repaired the defect, and while the next few days are critical, we're cautiously optimistic." A collective sigh of profound relief washed through the waiting area. Daniel pressed his hands over his face, his shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. Julia's tears flowed, too, a mixture of relief, gratitude, and awe. Kayla's recovery was neither instant nor smooth. She faced fluctuating vitals, medication tweaks, and slow steps toward regaining strength. Julia visited daily, often so Daniel could step away to update other relatives or grab some fresh air. Kayla grew more and more at ease with Julia, lighting up when she arrived with a new storybook or silly joke. Strangely, the local media continued to spotlight Kayla's plight, highlighting the shortfalls in coverage for military families. A brief interview segment even showed Julia and Daniel speaking side by side. Some viewers speculated whether romance was blossoming between them, but in truth, a far deeper bond was forming. A friendship forged from vulnerability, remorse, and a fierce desire to see Kayla thrive. Julia's act of giving money had opened her eyes to the bigger picture. Prejudice wasn't just in overt acts, but also in the subtle ways she'd once belittled Daniel. And she realized that if she truly cared, she needed to tackle her own biases. She began reflecting on her upbringing and affluent, predominantly white environment where prejudicial remarks, even if quietly stated, had shaped her worldview. She sought counseling, determined to confront the ingrained racism that had festered below the surface for so long. Meanwhile, Kayla gradually stabilized. A day finally arrived when her cardiologist said she was ready for partial release. Nurses removed a few of the tubes, and Kayla stood shakily, wearing a pair of bright sneakers that lit up whenever she took a step. She hugged Julia tightly as the discharge papers were signed. "Thank you for helping me," Kayla said with disarming sincerity. "Are you going to come visit me again?" Julia's voice caught. "Absolutely," she whispered, blinking back tears. Outside the hospital, Daniel turned to Julia. "There's no way I can repay you," he began quietly. "It wasn't just the money. You spent hours on calls, lobbied the hospital, sat with Kayla." Julia gave him a tremulous smile. "Just let me stay in Kayla's life," she said. "That's all I want." The next month brought a cautious return to normalcy, with Kayla on a careful medication schedule and shorter bouts of activity. Julia split her time between finishing her corporate tasks and helping Daniel handle continuing challenges, insurance documentation, setting up follow-up visits, and dealing with new health complications. The deeper she waded in, the more she saw how broken the system could be, especially for military families. The experience lit a new fire in her. At the office, she made proposals for corporate charity initiatives aimed at assisting children who needed specialized medical interventions. Management noticed her enthusiasm and soon offered a position leading a corporate social responsibility program, an opportunity she would have previously dismissed in favor of higher profile, higher paying roles. A few months later, on a mild autumn evening, Julia accepted an invitation to a family barbecue at Daniel's aunt's home in the suburbs of Atlanta. A modest house, a spacious backyard, and half a dozen children scampering around. Kayla among them. She occasionally had to rest, placing a hand over her scar. Julia was the only white person there, yet she was welcomed like an old friend. Sitting at a picnic table, sampling homemade potato salad, she watched Daniel teach Kayla how to throw a soft football. It wobbled hilariously, and Kayla giggled until she coughed lightly. Still healing, Daniel patiently corrected her stance, and on her next attempt, the ball flew a few feet further. That unfiltered laughter swelled, echoing in the evening air. Julia closed her eyes, inhaling the smoky smell of the grill. She recalled how it all started. Her brash prejudices unleashed on a flight, aimed at a soldier she decided didn't deserve first-class privileges. Fate or coincidence had forced her to look squarely at the most unpleasant aspects of herself, and in doing so, revealed an unexpected wellspring of empathy she never knew she had. As dusk settled, Kayla sidled up to her. "Miss Julia," she said, "do you have a storybook with you?" Her eyes sparkled with that lively curiosity children were so easily. "I sure do," Julia replied, rummaging in her bag for a slim, brightly illustrated book of fairy tales. She began reading under the glow of the porch light, weaving a gentle narrative about princesses who overcame adversity and knights who championed noble causes. Kayla listened, leaning her head against Julia's shoulder with unguarded trust. Daniel watched from a short distance, arms crossed, offering Julia a look of gratitude that spoke volumes. In that moment, Julia sensed how permanently her life had changed. Here was a soldier who had sacrificed for others, a resilient girl who refused to give up on life, and a woman who had recognized and confronted the racism within herself, choosing to do better. In the months and years that followed, Kayla recovered in gradual increments. Regular checkups, further minor procedures, and structured physical activities. Julia divided her efforts between her newly defined corporate role in philanthropy and volunteering with organizations that aided military families with complex healthcare needs. She became a fervent advocate for uprooting the systemic barriers that left so many like Daniel grappling for the basics. What started as guilt evolved into a sincere dedication to effect change. Though Julia could never erase her venomous words from that flight, she worked tirelessly to let her actions speak to her transformation. Over time, Daniel, Kayla, and Julia formed an unconventional sort of family. They weren't related by blood, but by the gratitude and devotion forged in the heat of crisis. What had begun as a ride stained by bigotry and contempt became a story of redemption, compassion, and our shared responsibility to care for one another, underscoring that our worst instincts can be overcome by honesty, empathy, and a willingness to grow.